Hey guys, welcome back for another episode of Kingdom Story. Today, we're going to be diving into the theme of fear and our story from Numbers 13 and 14. And if I just want to have us remember and kind of connect this story much bigger, 2 weeks ago, we found ourselves at Mount Sinai, at the base of Mount Sinai, right? As God made a covenant with his people, giving them the 10 commandments, giving them the law that was there. God was entering into a very special relationship with them that was much like marriage. In fact, the kind of whole procession of leading them to Mount Sinai was like as if a bride walking to the altar, ready to take their vows and join in this particular union. However, if you remember, the Israelites were basically in the middle of this ceremony when they decided that Moses was taking too long up on the mountain. So they told Aaron, hey, let's give you all our gold, and I want you to make us a golden calf, and we will worship that. And so they began to worship something else other than God. And it helps us to understand why we can so quickly lose our way even after a dramatic encounter with God. I know many of us have asked that question, like, how could God have shown up so powerfully in my life? And then just days later, hours later, weeks later, whatever it is, we find ourselves backsliding again. We find ourselves forgetting or downplaying that encounter with God. We see it over and over with the Israelite people. And while we don't want to have that backsliding, it gives us hope. And it gives us this kind of picture, this beautiful picture that God continues to pursue after us. Now, God was not surprised by the actions of his people, nor is he surprised by our own backsliding. He has known since the beginning that this would not be an easy journey for them or for us. However, God desires a deep, deep union with his people. So in our last lesson, the one we did last week's episode, we explored the Day of Atonement and this ritual ceremony that encapsulates that day. God gave instructions for this ceremony in Leviticus 16. Now, it can be tempting, as I mentioned last week, to skim through the book or not even read it at all, right? But there are riches upon riches that you can find throughout the entirety of Scripture, things that connect. I mean, Jesus can literally be found on every page if we're willing to study and if we're willing to look for it. In our story today, we're going to jump back on the tour bus. Our stories are kind of put together as if you were going to take a tour of a city, right? You can't explore every piece of the city. It would just take forever. But we're exploring the main parts that help us understand what this is about. And last week, we took an extended stay as we got off the bus at Mount Sinai. We really kind of took an understanding of what was going on in the wilderness as we looked at the Day of Atonement. Well, here we're back on the bus again. And so we're moving forward in the story. And that's going to take us right to the brink of the Promised Land. The Israelites' journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. And what a moment this should be, right? I mean, back from Abraham, when God led him in there, there was all the patriarchs, but then Israel got sent out because of the famine, and that's where they ended up in Egypt. And how we arrive at this place where they needed to be set free from slavery, and God is leading them back to the place that he had promised him. He sets them free. He's bound themselves to him in a covenant and led them to this land that he wished to give them. But unfortunately, as we'll see, things fall apart again. As we get to the brink, as we get on the edge of the Promised Land here, God instructs Moses to choose 12 men, one from every tribe. And their purpose is to go and spy out the land to make sure that it is as God said it was. God said that it was flowing with milk and honey, that it was an abundant land. But when these spies go in, they find that yes, it is abundant, but there's more in the land than just the good fruit. They see that there's also giants, and that there's mighty men and fortified cities. And for the two spies, this presents no problem to them. Out of the 12, there are 10 that see these giants, that see these they all see the fortified cities, but 10 who believe that there's no way they can take the city. There's no way they can take the land. There's 2 of them, however, that say, we see the giants, we see the fortified cities, but that's not a problem for us. These 2 know that God has promised them this land, and that the giants and fortified cities are no match for God. But the other 10 spies, they're afraid. Their fear has gotten the better of them, and they do not believe that they can take the land. They forget all that God has done for them. So let's just pause and think about this for a moment. We see that Joshua and Caleb, these are the names of the two spies, they cannot convince the Israelites that God can take the land despite what they see. The fear of the 10, though, the fear of their 10 is spreading throughout the Israelite congregation. And it has spread so much that eventually this congregation wants to stone Joshua and Caleb. They want to stone them to death. And they want to remove Moses as their leader and appoint someone who will take them back to Egypt. How often do we find ourselves on the edge of breakthrough, but we want to return to the life of slavery? Humans find themselves to be more comfortable in the misery that we know and are familiar with, because moving into lands unknown can be scary. And so better to stay in the misery that I am well acquainted with than to move into the lands that are unknown. I have no idea. It could be worse than I am now, but at least I know this pain. So let's go back to Egypt. I've used this with the guys that I work with in addiction. I'm like, do you want to go back to Egypt? Do you want to go back into your addiction? Or do you want to keep traveling into the land that God has given you? Well, this all leads us into the theme for our story, which is fear. Right? There are two types of fear that we see displayed in our story today. And the first is the fear that we all know, the fear that is keeping the 10 spies from seeing God clearly. These 10 are focused on their own ability or lack thereof, right? Because they don't think they have what it takes to get into the land. Their fear of to overcome the giants, right? This fear has plagued us all at one point or another. Recently, we feared the pandemic because of getting sick, because of the vaccine for some, for supply chain issues, for being locked up for as long as we were. There was much to fear here, and a lot of us let the fear get the better of us. We saw store shelves that were bare for months. People stocked up on toilet paper. I mean, it was insane, right? I mean, as if toilet paper is going to be the thing that solves all the problems for us. But we can be afraid of the dark. We can be afraid of the person that's walking towards us on the street. Like, fear is crippling. And at its worst, it can keep us locked in our homes, in our heads, and even in our hearts. But at its best, fear can help us avoid hazardous situations. And we've seen that fear is something that corrupt people in power can use to control those below them. And like most of our themes, I could do an entire video on fear. So let me know if that's something that you want to discuss further. But the other type of fear that we see is what is known as the fear of God. And now this is a challenging concept, whether you believe in God or not. We know that God is supposed to be the embodiment of love. And if that is true, then what is the fear of God? Does God want us to be afraid of him? Well, the answer is a little complicated. It's yes and no. I mean, God doesn't want us to fear him like a tyrant. That's not what God is after in this. God's not wanting us to fear him as someone who could lose control or lose his cool at any moment in time. That's not what God's talking about. He's also not talking about the fearing someone who responds disproportionately to the offense, right? As, causing more harm or conflict than what was actually done in the first offense. That's not what God is intending. What God is intending, the fear we speak of here, would be better understood as reverence or awe, right? Respect might be another word that I use. And this could potentially be a bad analogy for some, but I think we would understand if we talk about a gun or a firearm, right? It is a weapon that can cause severe damage to you or to someone else, right? And there is a healthy fear that we should have when operating a gun. This fear helps us to respect its capability. We must use it safely and remembering all the rules when we come to this. Never point it at something you don't intend to shoot. Always know what is beyond your target. Always treat the weapon as if it is loaded, right? Ignoring these rules can have serious consequences. And the reality is that the same is true for God. He is holy. He is just. He is mighty. He is powerful. He is also intimate. He is gentle. He is loving. And both of these have to be held together and must be respected when we come to God. Joshua and Caleb had a healthy fear of God. And I'm not saying they weren't afraid of the giants, right, in the land, but they knew that God would go before them. So let's take a closer look at the story itself. Right? The first section that we'll look at is Numbers 13:26 through 33. This is where the 12 spies bring back their report. Right? As I mentioned earlier, the 10 come back with a harrowing account that the giants and the cities are just too great for them to overcome. In fact, they say, we appeared like grasshoppers to them. But the 2 see the obstacle, but they have their feet firmly planted in their trust in God. I want you to just think for a second about what the trip back, right? These 12 spies go into the land, they spy it out, now they're on their return journey. What must that have been like? What were the conversations? Guaranteed they were all conversing about what they saw, right? But unfortunately, it seems that in this trip back, Joshua and Caleb were unable to sway the opinion of the 10. I wonder how much arguing was there, how much scheming there was by the 10 to try to know that they had to try to convince the Israelite community. They're so afraid about going in here. They don't want Joshua and Caleb to convince everybody that it's a good idea, right? And so when they come back, right, and they share their opinion with others, the community begins to complain against Moses and Aaron. They believe Moses and Aaron brought them this way into the wilderness just to simply die here, right? And they act as if, like, well, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? Because you bring us out here to die? We could have at least died more comfortably back there. In the following section in Numbers 14:1 through 5 shows how fear can cause us to make irrational decisions. And Moses and Aaron are beside themselves because of what's happening. When they hear the cries of the people, both Moses and Aaron fall flat on their faces. And it's not clear why they're falling. They could be falling before God in worship. They could be falling before the people in panic. Or they could just be trying to avoid the impending lightning strike that they think might come because of the people's complaining. But either way, I'm sure that they didn't want this particular argument to continue. All right, but in the next section, Numbers 14:6 to 11, Joshua and Caleb try again to sway the people's opinion. They are trying to get people to remember what God had done for them, right? Just a year ago. It's not even that long ago. But the dramatic signs and the wonders and the defeat of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, this was just not enough to convince them. And the guys, Joshua and Caleb's plea falls on deaf ears. Right? The congregation doesn't even comment on what was said. They simply want to kill Joshua and Caleb for their response. Do you see the irrational decisions that are being made here? The fear that is causing them to do this, right? Do you act irrationally when fear rises in you, right? We're not thinking clearly when fear overtakes us, and we want to do what is going to make the fear go away or remove us from the situation as quickly as possible. Joshua and Caleb would be the only ones from this generation that would enter the land. Because of their fear and lack of faith in God's promises, God gives them over to what they wanted. They didn't want to go in the promised land, so God didn't allow them to go into the promised land. They are now sentenced to wander in the wilderness until this generation has died off. And we might think that it's harsh punishment, that God's not allowing them to enter, but they didn't want to, right? They said, we don't want to go into the land. We don't want to fight these giants. We'd rather go back to Egypt. God doesn't send them back to Egypt, but he does allow them not to enter the promised land. Well, now we move into looking at the character of God. And it can be hard to see God's character in this because we don't see God's activity in the story until the end. And when we do see it, it's coming in kind of in anger and in judgment. But let's take a closer look, right? God instructs them to spy out the land to ensure that it is as he says it is. Like, God knew the land was flowing with milk and honey, but he wanted his people to have eyes on it. Right? As much as God wants us to trust him, he gives us he throws us a bone. He allows us to see some things for ourselves so that we can be moved forward in our trust. We can confirm and affirm the trust that we do have, right? Even after all he had done, he wanted to ensure that they were convinced that the land was indeed good, right? What does that say about God? I believe it shows us that God is understanding, right? He understands our shortcomings. He wants to meet us where we are. He knows that we have doubts. And especially if we're going to take a big leap, like needing to go in and deal with these giants, it would be fantastic to know that the land is actually as God said it was, that it is flowing with milk and honey, right? Well, Joshua and Caleb also point to a God who is powerful, right? A God who keeps his promises. A God who would not release them from slavery just to bring them this far to have them slaughtered on the edge of the promised land, right? God has to be powerful if he's going to come against these giants and these fortified cities. He has to be the one to keep his promises. If he's given this promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and says, I want to bring you into the land that I promised to your fathers, right? And God could have just left them in Egypt and allowed them to be slaughtered there. Why would he bring them this far? Joshua and Caleb really understood this. And we see that he keeps his word. He keeps his promise. He told them the land was flowing with milk and honey. Their eyes saw it for themselves, right? God keeps giving them and us little gifts that help us trust him more and more. And by the end of the story, we also see a God that gets angry, right? God has dealt with their adultery, their complaining, their fits against Moses and Aaron. And despite what God has done for them and how he has released them from slavery, from Egypt, and provided for them in the wilderness, they keep believing that God is not good. They keep not trusting him or even growing in their trust. I mean, I can understand not giving complete trust over him, but begin to trust him more and more. And so God in his anger and in his justness moves them and gives them what they desire, right? They didn't want to go into the land, as I said already, so God granted them their wish. Their fear got the best of them. I mean, we see this in the New Testament, in Romans, as Paul talks about, that God will give you over to the desires of your heart, and you will suffer the consequences for desiring the things that you desire. I mean, it's not God's punishment. It's just the way it is. If you choose not to give up your addiction, if you want to go back to Egypt, then you'll suffer the consequences of what it means to go back to Egypt. God doesn't want that for you, but if that's what you want and you continue to rebel, then he's going to give you over to that. And that brings us to our challenge this week. Where is fear plaguing your life? Is there a conversation you need to have but are afraid to have it? Is there an action that you need to do but are scared to do it? Is there a healing that you need in your life, but you're afraid to dig up your past and to go back to some of those painful memories? How can we walk against our fears today? More importantly, how can we grow in our trust for God more today? In that, perhaps we can find the courage to overcome our fears. The more we trust God, instead of just trying to pony up and go against our fears, how do we grow in our trust for God? And how does that help us overcome our fears? And that leads us into a little bit of what we'll be discussing next week as we see Joshua entering into the promised land and God needing to encourage him to be courageous. I continue to pray for you all and all that God is doing in your life. Pray that you're finding breakthrough in areas. I pray that these videos are life-giving to you and they're beginning to unpack the story. Fear does not have to control you. 1 John 4:18 says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Don't punish yourself. Live into God's love and find courage for you today. Until next time, y'all, I hope you continue to find your place in God's story.